There was a particularly horrible case last week. It's actually a case in Northern Ireland, but it throws up a very interesting legal point that rather bizarrely might become relevant to all the post office inquiry stuff. So first let me give you some background. And again, I'm going to have to sort of use quite a lot of euphemisms here just for the YouTube algorithm. And also, if I was the sort of person who gave out content warnings, I'd give you a content warning, because this is a really horrible story. But essentially, a young man, he's a young man, he was online pretending to be a young girl. And he contacted girls all around the world and befriended them. Like I say, pretended to be a young girl himself. And he encouraged them to send him sordid material. I mean, photographs of themselves indecent, to use the legislation. Photographs. I mean, the irony there is, it's actually an offence, even for a child, to send a photograph of themselves. Although obviously in this case, they recognise the children were victims. However, once they had sent him the photographs, he then went and blackmailed them. He threatened to make them all public unless they engaged in even worse activity. He was having them videoing themselves and also videoing themselves with other young children. Now, what's weird about this is, this all came to light in 2016. So he was first charged in 2016, but he was actually released on bail pending investigation. And he continued to do this. And eventually in 2019, they remanded him into custody while they investigated all this. Well, last week, he finally pleaded guilty. He pleaded guilty to 180 counts of, soliciting minors to provide this and various other offences. But also, one poor girl, 12-year-old girl in the United States, she was so upset with this and with the blackmail that she self-deleted, to use the YouTube-friendly algorithm. So what's very interesting is they charged him with manslaughter on the back of that. So this throws some interesting issues up. I mean, he pleaded guilty to this, so it wasn't tested in court. Although, as I've said before, the test for manslaughter, there have been situations where this has happened before, where people have driven to people to such an extent that they have unalived themselves. There was a particular case where somebody threw some acid over somebody and they just couldn't cope with, being disfigured. And they actually went through all the assisted thing, and they said, we will charge you and prosecute you for manslaughter. It also didn't matter that this had happened in the United States. Now, when they actually sentenced him, they actually arranged a sentencing for 2 p.m. to make sure all the people in the US could actually video link in to watch this. Although it's not been put in the public domain, there was like a closed circuit so people could see this. So he was convicted on his plea of all these offences, including manslaughter. And this, like I say, this comes into a couple of things. Like, first of all, there's what we call extraterritoriality. Where was the offence committed? Well, the offence was, they said, the offence was committed in Northern Ireland, but it didn't matter that actually the poor girl who was driven to this lived in the United States. And when it comes to extraterritoriality, various countries do claim the right to prosecute people in other countries, and that can depend on the nature of the offence and also what connection the person has with the country. I mean, there's lots of offences in the UK where or England and Wales, where the relevant governments reserve the right to prosecute people for offences committed abroad, even if they are not British citizens, but if they have a connection with this country, like they are ordinarily resident here, for instance. And sometimes they'll do that even if it's not an offence in the relevant country. They brought in various rules and regulations and legislation against sexual trafficking. So it wasn't a defence for people to say, well, I've gone to some country where the age of consent is different. It was like, well, no, we are still going to prosecute you for this because we think it's something that should be clamped down on. And, England and Wales, we reserve the right to prosecute for murder anywhere in the world, regardless of whether the person has any connection with the United Kingdom or not. I mean, this is why, for instance, we've been able to prosecute concentration camp guards years afterwards, because even if they could argue they no longer had a connection with this country. I mean, obviously, you get into all the practicalities about how do you physically get hold of them to prosecute them, but we've had it where people have returned to this country or visited this country and said, you committed an offence while abroad. I mean, like lots of things with the ISIS thing, and therefore we retain jurisdiction over you. But there's also the element of why was it manslaughter? Well, like I say, this has always been the case that if you commit an unlawful act, and as a result of that unlawful act, somebody dies, and you can show that there's direct causation, that's enough for manslaughter. We use the but-for test, and it's very, very simple. But for you doing that unlawful act, i.e. getting these pictures and then blackmailing somebody, and blackmail is obviously an unlawful act, would that girl have... just take the microphone there. Would that poor girl have taken her own life? And obviously she wouldn't have, so it all seems very clear-cut. But what about the post office? Well, obviously a lot of people who were falsely prosecuted, you know, they unalived themselves. I know of at least 4 cases. So, can you show that that is because somebody engaged in an unlawful act and it was directly causative? Well, what's the unlawful act? Well, we've had all sorts of stuff. Attempts to pervert the course of justice is the obvious one. Arguably fraud. I mean, there's a whole host of offences that people acting for the post office may have committed, especially if they knew that, you know, these prosecutions were unsustainable. I mean, don't get me wrong, people will have strong defences here and say, well, arguably it wasn't an unlawful act, and even if it was, you can't say that what we did was directly causative. But I think if you apply that very simple but-for test, and I say the but-for test has been criticised because it can, you know, be very, very wide. Because theoretically, there's a whole chain of causation. Any bit which wasn't there, it would have been but for that bit, this wouldn't have happened. But in this particular case, I think it'd be a very easy argument to make to a jury and say, but for the post office prosecutors engaging in this unlawful attempt to pervert the course of justice, these people would not have taken their own lives. So it'll be very interesting to see what happens there. I mean, obviously we're still a long way off. We've still got the latest phase of the post office inquiry to go. And as I've mentioned before, the criminal investigation, the police have said we will start that at the conclusion of the, the general inquiry, which is unusual because normally you have, where there's a possibility of an inquiry and then a criminal trial, you have the criminal trial first. I mean, that's what happened obviously with the Lucy Letby thing. They had the trial and now they're having the inquiry. Because apart from anything else, if you do it the other way around, you get lots of people saying, I will exercise my right not to self-incriminate, so I won't give evidence. It's not the Fifth Amendment in this country, but it's the same rule. You have a right not to self-incriminate, but the test is, the answer you give to the question must have a tendency to self-incriminate. So when people say, well, you can't read anything into somebody taking the fifth, well, arguably you can. Because if you say, well, I didn't do it anyway, then you can't exercise the right against self-incrimination because you wouldn't be self-incriminating if you're saying, I didn't do it. So, but that's why, like I said, normally they do it the other way around because, we did have people in the post office inquiry saying, I'm not going to answer those questions because I'll self-incriminate. But there you go, horrible thing. What happened to the guy? Well, he got a life sentence with a minimum tariff of 20 years. But, I mean, the thing is, he's just so young. I mean, he started this when he was, in his teens himself. So he'll only be, about 40 when he's up for sort of earliest release, assuming he gets that far. But also, when we talk about two-tier justice and why do offences take so long to get to trial, like I say, he was first arrested for this back in 2016. He was remanded in custody in 2019. And ironically, even though this has been a guilty plea, it's taken 5 years to get to this stage. But, there were 180 counts on the indictment. And obviously the police wanted to check everything and to try and see what other victims were out there. So that's why this has been such a lengthy investigation and that's why it took so long. But there you go. Anyway, so, hope you found that vaguely interesting, vaguely useful, no doubt wildly infuriating. Where am I today? I'm at a place called Portmellon. The harbour that should never have been built, they call it, just because it sort of funnels the water in. But it's quite nice. So what I'll do is I'll just pan around so you can just see where I am. So if I just press that button there, that should do it. Okay, so over there's a pub called The Ship that's really, really nice, especially in the winter because all the waves crash over. That is the harbour itself, and just the other side, that's one of the cannons guarding the harbour. There's another one on the other side, which we don't use so much these days, notwithstanding people coming down from St Austell. And just over the wall is the church, which again, when there's even the slightest storm here, you just have the waves just sort of crashing straight over that.